Imagine the fear, the gut-wrenching fear of not knowing, just not knowing what happened to your child. It's a nightmare. But for Brenda McCoy, it was her reality after her 15-year-old daughter, Selene 80, vanished. Just vanished in 2004. And today we're taking a deep dive into Selene's case. It's a story, really, about teenage struggles and a truly tragic discovery. But even after 18 years, there's still hope for justice for Selene.
Yeah, what really strikes me right from the start is just the sheer number of questions, the unanswered questions in this case. We're dealing with a young girl just trying to find her way, navigate adolescence, and then you have a family trying to cope with an unimaginable loss. And really, the entire community is marked by this unsolved mystery. It's heavy.
It really is. And we're really lucky to have this kind of unique perspective on this investigation through an episode of the Deck podcast. They had Detective Joy Cronus on, and she's been working on Selene's case, well, really from the very beginning.
And her dedication to this case, you can just tell. I mean, the fact that she can remember all these little details after all this time, it just speaks volumes about her commitment to finding out what happened to Selene.
Oh, absolutely. So let's sort of set the scene, right? Paint a picture of Selene's life. She was living in South Carolina with her mother and two younger siblings, but her life wasn't exactly simple. 10 years before she disappeared, she had lost her adoptive father. And that's a trauma, a loss that must have really had an impact on her as she went through those teenage years.
Absolutely. Losing a parent, especially at that age, it really can have a profound effect on a child and how they develop. It's quite possible that Selene was, dealing with unresolved grief, maybe expressing it through some of the rebellious behavior we'll talk about.
Yeah, and the sources we looked at described her, Selene, as going through a bit of a rebellious phase, running away, clashing with her mom. It even sounds like she might have been involved with a local street gang. Her mom mentioned that she always wore red and black, and that seems to be a sign of some gang affiliation.
Well, those details about the gang, we need to look at them carefully. It's really important, to avoid jumping to conclusions based on, well, appearances. It's easy to do, but we have to avoid it.
You're right. It's always a balancing act, isn't it? We want to be thorough and investigate everything, but at the same time, we don't want to fall into harmful stereotypes. So on the night she disappeared, April 15, 2004, Selene snuck out of her house. It turned out her neighbor actually saw her leaving and even called out to her, but Selene just disappeared into the night.
And the fact that Selene, had a history of running away, well, that just complicates things even more. It sounds like her mother didn't immediately contact the police because she thought, oh, maybe she'll just come back on her own, like she had before.
It's just tragic, isn't it?
Yeah.
A very pattern, something that might have been reassuring in the past, ended up delaying the investigation. And we know that in missing persons cases, time is just, well, it's crucial.
It is, yeah. It's absolutely critical. Time is really of the essence in these situations. Any delay can make it so much harder to gather evidence and follow leads.
Yeah. And this Deck podcast episode had another kind of a chilling detail. Selene was known to accept rides from, well, anyone she recognized. So that tells us something about her, maybe a trusting nature, but it also unfortunately points to a certain vulnerability that could have been taken advantage of.
It does. And, it makes you think, she might have been looking for connection, looking to belong, maybe even trying to get away from a tough situation at home. But tragically, it also made her a target for anyone who might have wanted to take advantage of her.
So let's talk about this detective, Detective Joy Cronus. The host of the Deck podcast described her as a real veteran, someone who has this almost uncanny ability to remember details from her cases.
Oh, yeah. It's amazing. Detective Cronus, she has a sharp memory, that's for sure. But beyond that, you can hear she has a lot of empathy, a real sense of caring. Her dedication to Selene's case, after all these years, you can just tell she's committed to getting justice for Selene and for her mother, too.
2 days after Selene disappeared, there was just this horrifying discovery. Firefighters, they were responding to a brush fire, and they found a badly burned body.
And the condition of her remains, Selene's remains, I mean, they were in such bad shape that it made identification extremely difficult. They were only able to confirm it was her using dental records, and she had this pretty distinctive necklace, and that helped too. Can you imagine the wait for those results, knowing that it could be Selene?
It's heartbreaking. Just heartbreaking. And the medical examiner, they determined that she had been beaten, brutally beaten. And it's possible, they say, that she was even alive when she was set on fire. The level of violence, it's hard to even fathom.
Yeah, it's awful. And it makes you ask, what would drive someone to do something like this, something so horrific? The brutality, it really does point to a personal motive, maybe fueled by rage or hatred or even revenge. It's a dark thought, but it's important, to try to understand that motive if we want to solve this case.
Of course. And so the police, they started their investigation by looking into Celine's social life, hoping to find some clue, some indication of who might have wanted to hurt her.
Yeah, it's standard procedure. They went through her call logs, talked to her friends, teachers, and even people from her previous school. It's a real painstaking process trying to put the pieces together, trying to understand her life, her relationships.
And what's interesting is, despite the fact that Celine had this outgoing personality, she knew a lot of people. But the initial inquiries didn't turn up any clear suspects. Nobody really stood out.
It's almost as if whoever did this, they were operating in secret, in the shadows, very carefully hiding their motives, their actions. Or maybe, just maybe, it was someone unexpected, lurking on the edge of her social circle, someone nobody would suspect.
So one thing the investigators looked at was the possibility that Celine was involved with a local street gang. That came up because her mother had mentioned how she always wore red and black clothing.
Right, and that's a detail worth exploring, but again, we have to be cautious. We can't let assumptions based on, what someone was wearing overshadow other leads, other possibilities in the investigation.
I agree. We have to keep an open mind, consider every angle, and avoid, as we said, those harmful stereotypes. Investigators also considered whether Celine maybe had a secret boyfriend or some kind of romantic involvement that went wrong.
Yeah, that's logical. It suggests they were thinking about a crime of passion, maybe driven by jealousy or a need to control. But like the gang connection, we can't jump to conclusions without solid evidence. We have to be careful.
And unfortunately, the investigation seemed to hit a wall. A lot of questions, but not a lot of answers. So let's turn our attention to where Celine's body was found. It was a pretty remote, wooded area, really difficult to get to unless you knew the area well.
Yeah, the remoteness of that crime scene, that's a significant detail for sure. It really suggests that whoever did this, well, they chose that location for a reason. They wanted seclusion, anonymity, they wanted to make sure they weren't seen.
And the Deck podcast host, he described it as a place you wouldn't just stumble upon by accident. You had to know how to get there. You had to have a reason to be there.
Exactly. And they mentioned an old logging road nearby, and investigators think that might have been how the killer got to the site. So that reinforces the idea that whoever committed this crime might have been familiar with the area, maybe even someone local.
It is a chilling thought, isn't it? That something so dark could happen in a place that seems peaceful and familiar. It makes you think. And tragically, Celine's mother, Brenda, she died in 2020, and she never found out what happened to her daughter.
That's just awful. Another layer of tragedy, isn't it? To die without any closure, without knowing what happened to your child. It really speaks to the long-lasting impact of these violent crimes. It's not just the victim, it's the entire family, the whole community that suffers.
It's true. It's a reminder that these cases, they aren't just abstract mysteries. There are real people involved, real families dealing with real, unimaginable heartbreak. But even with all the tragedy, even with the years that have passed, there's still a glimmer of hope, a chance that Celine's case could be solved.
And this is where it gets interesting. Even though time has passed, there's always a chance for a breakthrough. There was forensic evidence collected at the scene, and with all the advances we've made in technology, what seemed like a dead end years ago might hold the key to solving the whole thing. It's pretty incredible.
You're right, it's not a closed book, not at all. There's still an active investigation, new technology to use, and maybe most important of all, there's a possibility that someone out there knows something, has a piece of the puzzle.
That's why it's so important for anyone with information, even if it seems small or insignificant, to come forward. Those memories, they can come back. Connections can be made. And what might seem like nothing to one person, well, to investigators, it could be the missing link. It's just amazing to think about how far forensic science has come since 2004. Back then, some little trace of evidence may be too small or degraded to analyze. Well, now with today's technology, it could be the key to cracking the whole case wide open.
Yeah, it really shows you how important it is to have investigators like Detective Cronus, people who don't give up. She's not just stuck in the past. She's using all these new tools and techniques in her search for justice for Selene.
Exactly. And it's not just about the physical evidence either. Detective Cronus, she was willing to revisit the case with the Deck podcast. She walked them through the whole crime scene. I mean, that shows real dedication, keeping Selene's story out there, in the public eye.
Yeah, that visit to the crime scene, it was really something. The way she described it, the remoteness, the isolation, it gave you a real sense of what happened there, the tragedy of it all.
And that isolation, it wasn't just by chance. It tells us something about the killer, that they planned this out, that they chose that spot to make sure they wouldn't be seen.
And remember, there was that old logging road nearby. Investigators think that's how the killer got to the site. That's a big clue, isn't it?
Yeah.
It points to someone who knew the area, someone who wouldn't look out of place being there.
It does. It suggests someone who was comfortable in that environment, someone who could move around without anyone noticing them. That kind of familiarity, well, it could be a crucial part of the puzzle.
But it's not just the location that's haunting. The brutality of it all, the fact that Selene was beaten so badly before being set on fire, that adds a whole other dimension to the case, a real disturbing element.
Yeah, you're right. Sometimes people burn a body to destroy evidence, but it's rarely completely effective. But beyond the practical side of it, you have to think about the psychology, the mental state of the perpetrator. That level of violence, it tells us it was more than just getting rid of a body. It was something more.
It makes you think, doesn't it? Maybe it wasn't just about silencing Selene. Maybe it was about punishing her, about inflicting pain, going beyond just ending her life.
Yeah, that's a good point. A really chilling thought, but valid. The level of brutality, it often reflects what the killer was feeling. Was it rage, hatred, a need to be in control? Those are the kinds of questions investigators have to wrestle with if they want to understand what motivated this crime.
And of course, Selene's mother, Brenda, she never saw the case solved. She died in 2020 without ever knowing what happened to her daughter. Just adds to the heartbreak of this whole story.
It does. It reminds us that these crimes, they have these ripple effects. The trauma spreads outward. It's not just the victim, it's the families, the friends, the whole community. Brenda's story, it's a powerful reminder that justice isn't just about catching the killer. It's about giving those left behind a sense of closure, a chance to heal.
And that's why it's so important to keep investigating these cold cases. Even though so much time has passed, the fight for justice for Selene, it shouldn't just fade away.
Absolutely not. And there's reason to be hopeful. Like we were talking about, forensic science has advanced so much. Imagine, for example, a tiny bloodstain found at the scene, maybe too degraded to analyze in 2004. Well, now it could be used to create a DNA profile of the killer.
Or maybe a fiber from a piece of clothing, something overlooked back then, could now be matched to a specific manufacturer, or even a batch of fabric, narrowing down the possibilities.
Exactly. Technology, it can breathe new life into these old cases. And when you combine that with good old-fashioned detective work and the chance that new witnesses might come forward, well, the odds of solving Celine's case, they're still pretty good.
It's pretty amazing to think that someone out there might have that missing piece of the puzzle. Maybe they saw something years ago but didn't think it was important, or maybe a memory has just popped up recently. You never know.
That's exactly why it's so important to stress that no piece of information is too small. Something that seems insignificant to one person, it could be exactly what investigators need.
Maybe they overheard a conversation, saw a car that looked suspicious, noticed someone acting strange around the time Selene disappeared. Those details, they could be vital.
And if this deep dive, if it sparked a memory, if you have a feeling, a gut feeling that you might know something, even if it's just a small thing, please call the Richland County Cold Case Unit. Don't hesitate.
That call, it could be the one that finally brings Selene's killer to justice and gives her family the answers they've been waiting for all these years.
It's never too late. Even after 18 years, the truth matters. Celine's story deserves an ending, and her family deserves closure.
So as we kind of wrap up our thoughts on Selene's case, I think what really sticks with me is the hope. Even with all the sadness, all the questions that are still unanswered, there's this feeling that justice is still possible.
Yeah.
Even after all this time.
It is. It really is. And I think it shows you something about us, about humans. We need to find meaning. We need resolution, even when faced with something as awful as this. Celine's case might be cold, but people haven't forgotten her. Not at all.
And that's really because of people like Detective Cronus. She just refuses to give up. She's looking for answers, she's using new technology, and she's making sure people don't forget Selene. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, she's a real advocate for justice. It's more than a job to her, you can tell. It's like she made a promise to Selene and her family, and she won't break it until she finds out the truth.
And it makes you think, we all have a part to play in these kinds of cases. We might not be detectives or scientists, but we can still be aware. We can watch out for each other, Trust our gut feelings when something seems wrong, and speak up if we think we might have some information that could help.
That's so true. Sometimes it's the tiniest detail, something you might not even think twice about, that ends up being the key to solving a case, like maybe overhearing a conversation, or seeing a car that seemed out of place, or noticing that someone was acting strange around the time Selene disappeared. Little things like that, when you put them together, they can actually tell a story.
Yeah, exactly. So if anything in this deep dive, anything at all has made you think of something, even if you're not sure it's important, please call the Richland County Cold Case Unit. It could be the call they've been waiting for.
It really could. It's never too late to come forward. Even after 18 years, the truth still matters. Selene deserves justice, and her family deserves some peace.
Selene Edie's case, it's a tough one, and it reminds us that bad things can happen anywhere, even in places that seem safe. It makes you think about, well, about cherishing your loved ones, being aware of what's going on around you, and never giving up hope.
And I think it also reminds us that everyone's life is important, every story is worth telling, and that we should never stop searching for the truth. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.